The household at Inverell Park received her on a Tuesday in October, when the last of the dahlias had gone to rot and the drive was thick with chestnut leaves that no one had swept, because the second footman had taken a fever and the first was occupied with silver. She arrived carrying a single valise of brown leather, worn pale at the corners, and a letter of reference from a Mrs. Cathcart of Devizes, a respectable name that no one at Inverell had cause to verify, though they might have, had they thought to look closely at the hand that wrote it. They did not look closely. No one ever did. Mrs. Ordish, the housekeeper, met her in the servants' hall with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had managed 14 staff through 3 dukes and did not intend to waste her afternoon on a replacement chambermaid. The girl, and she did look girlish, with her slight frame and her eyes cast perpetually downward, presented the letter and then stood with her hands folded while Mrs. Ordish read it. When Mrs. Ordish asked her name, the girl opened a small notebook she carried in her apron pocket and wrote in a neat, slanting hand, "Morin." When Mrs. Ordish asked whether she could speak, the girl shook her head once, lifted her chin just enough to show she was not ashamed of it, and then lowered it again. Mrs. Ordish studied her for a long moment. She had employed a girl once before who could not hear, and that had been perfectly manageable. The girl read lips and was excellent with linen. A mute chambermaid was, if anything, less trouble. The work required no conversation. The house required discretion. Mrs. Ordish wrote the name in the household ledger. Morin, no surname offered, none pressed for, assigned her the small room at the end of the servants' corridor, and told Jessup the butler to show her the way. Jessup, who had been at Inverell longer than anyone except the East Wing mice, glanced at the girl's valise, at her downcast eyes, at the notebook already tucked back into her pocket, and said nothing. He showed her the room. He showed her where the brushes were kept. He closed the door behind him and went back to his silver. Within a week, she had become invisible. This was not a failure on the part of the household. It was a kind of genius on the part of the girl. She learned the rhythms of the house the way a musician learns a score, which corridors were used at which hours, which rooms the Duke preferred in the morning versus the afternoon, when the library was occupied and when it was not. She cleaned around the household's life without ever intersecting it. The fire was laid before anyone woke. The linens were changed while the family was at dinner. The study was dusted while the Duke was riding. She moved through Inverell Park like weather, present, unnoticed, shaping everything. Lawrence Selwick, 5th Duke of Inverell, was not a cruel man, nor even a careless one in the ways that cruelty usually required. He was merely occupied. He had inherited the dukedom at 23 when his father's heart had stopped mid-sentence during a debate in the House of Lords, an event that the newspapers reported with the kind of breathless solemnity usually reserved for military defeats, and had spent the subsequent 9 years managing an estate of 11,000 acres, 3 tenancies in arrears, a crumbling East Wing, and a seat in the Lords that demanded his presence in London for 4 months of every year. He noticed his staff in the way that a man notices the walls of his own house, aware of their existence, dependent upon their function, largely unable to describe them if pressed. He knew Mrs. Ordish because Mrs. Ordish had been a fixture since before his birth and had opinions she did not trouble to conceal. He knew Jessup because Jessup served his wine and had once, memorably, caught a falling candelabra during a dinner party with a reflexive grace that the Duke privately envied. He knew Pollard, his steward, because Pollard brought him numbers and the numbers required decisions. He did not know Morin. He was aware, in the vaguest possible way, that a new chambermaid had been hired. Mrs. Ordish had mentioned it, and that this maid was quiet. Quiet suited him. He did not think about it further. This was, of course, the arrangement upon which everything would eventually turn. The months passed in the way that months pass in a great house, marked not by calendars but by fires lit and fires banked, by the rotation of bed curtains from summer muslin to winter wool, by the particular quality of light in the breakfast room as the sun moved lower and lower toward the horizon, and the mornings grew dark. Morin cleaned the Duke's study twice a week, always on the days when he rode out to the tenant farms with Pollard. She cleaned the library on the evenings when he dined at the Throckmortons or attended the assembly rooms in the village. She cleaned the breakfast room before dawn and was gone before the first footman laid the table. But a house is not a clock, and schedules do not hold. The Duke's ride was cancelled one morning in November because the bay horse threw a shoe. He returned to the study to find the door ajar and Marin on her knees beside the desk, polishing the brass fittings on the lower drawers. She rose immediately, bobbed a curtsy, and moved toward the door. He waved her back, the gesture of a man who did not wish to disrupt a servant's work, and sat down at his desk while she continued. He read his correspondence aloud that morning. Not to her. He had forgotten she was there within minutes. He read aloud because he thought better when he heard the words, and because the letter from his solicitor was complex and the figures needed parsing. He read the solicitor's assessment of the drainage scheme. He read a note from Lord Beckford regarding a vote on the Corn Laws that was expected before Christmas. He read, with audible irritation, a letter from his mother in Bath asking whether he intended to marry before she died, or whether she should make peace with the Almighty on that particular disappointment. Marin polished the brass fittings. She did not look up. She did not react. She finished, rose, curtsied, and left. It happened again in December and again in January, and by February it had ceased to be an accident and become a pattern. The Duke's schedule shifted with the season. Shorter days meant shorter rides, and the study was occupied more often when Marin came to clean. He never sent her away. She was quiet. She was unobtrusive. She moved around him the way she moved around everything, like water finding the lowest ground. He spoke freely in front of her, not because he trusted her. Trust implied awareness, but because she had become, in his mind, no different from the furniture. He dictated letters to Pollard with Marin dusting the mantelpiece. He received his solicitor in the library with Marin replacing the candles in the wall sconces. He argued with his mother's latest letter, aloud as though the Dowager Duchess were present and could hear his exasperation, while Marin swept the hearth 3 feet away. She heard everything. She heard that the drainage scheme was a disaster, and that the tenants in the North Acres had not paid rent since Michaelmas, and that the Duke suspected his solicitor of incompetence, but lacked the energy to replace him. She heard that Lord Beckford's position on the Corn Laws was, in the Duke's private assessment, craven and self-serving. She heard that the East Wing's roof would cost £4,000 to repair, and that the Duke had precisely £2,000 available, and no intention of selling land to make up the difference. She heard his mother's letters, every one of them, and the particular quality of exhaustion in his voice when he read the passages about marriage, not anger, not defiance, but the bone-deep fatigue of a man who had been asked the same question for 9 years and had no answer that would satisfy. She heard him say, one evening in March when he thought he was alone in the library but was not, he was never alone in the way he believed, that he was tired, that the house was too large for one man, that sometimes, late at night, the silence in the corridors sounded less like peace and more like something waiting. Marin heard this. She set down the candlestick she had been polishing. She stood very still for a moment. Then she picked it up again and finished her work and left. Mrs. Ordish, who missed very little, noticed the girl, not the hearing. Mrs. Ordish did not know what the girl heard in the Duke's study because Mrs. Ordish was not present for those mornings. What she noticed was simpler and more troubling. The girl's hands. They were not a chambermaid's hands. They were soft in the wrong places and calloused in the wrong places, and they held a pen the way a person holds a pen when they have been writing since childhood, not gripping it like a tool, but resting it between the fingers like an extension of thought. Mrs. Ordish noticed, too, that the girl's handwriting in her little notebook was not merely neat but educated. The slant was continental, the formation of certain letters French. When Marin wrote, "The latch on the second-floor linen cupboard needs mending," she wrote it with the penmanship of a woman who had been taught by a governess, or better. Mrs. Ordish said nothing. She had managed 14 staff through 3 dukes, and she had learned that silence, applied correctly, revealed more than questions ever did. The dinner was arranged for the 14th of April, a Thursday, because the Comte de Serenville was passing through the county on his way to Bristol, and the Duke, whose father had maintained a diplomatic correspondence with the Comte's family for 30 years, felt obliged to offer hospitality. It was not a large affair. The Comte, his secretary, Lord and Lady Throckmorton from the neighboring estate, and the Reverend Mr. Hyle, who spoke passable French and had agreed to act as informal translator since the Duke's own French was limited to the few phrases he had retained from a tutor he had dismissed at 16 for boring him. The dinner began well enough. The comte was a man of 60, with the careful politeness of someone accustomed to being misunderstood in foreign countries. The Reverend Mr. Hale translated with enthusiasm, if not precision, rendering the comte's remarks about English weather into something that sounded, to the Duke's ear, slightly more philosophical than the comte had likely intended. The trouble began with the second course. The comte, emboldened by the claret, moved from pleasantries to substance. He wished to discuss the matter that had brought him to England, a proposed agreement between certain English landowners and a French trading company regarding wool exports. The terms were specific. The figures were detailed. The Reverend Mr. Hale, whose French had been acquired during a year of theological study in Lausanne and had not been tested against commercial vocabulary, began to falter. He translated tarif douanier as customs arrangement, which was close enough, but then rendered clause de résiliation anticipée as the early unpleasantness clause, which was not close at all, and the comte's expression shifted from patience to something more guarded. The Duke saw it. He saw the comte's courtesy beginning to curdle into the particular disdain that continental diplomats reserved for the English when they suspected they were not being taken seriously. He saw Lord Throckmorton, who spoke no French whatsoever, smiling blandly. He saw the Reverend Mr. Hale reaching for his wine-glass with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. The Duke opened his mouth to suggest an adjournment, to move the commercial discussion to the following morning when perhaps a more qualified translator might be found, and then a voice spoke from the doorway. It was clear and low and carried the particular music of a woman who had learned French not from a tutor, but from living inside the language, the vowels shaped by years of use rather than hours of instruction. It said in flawless Parisian French that the comte's proposed terms regarding the early termination clause were, if she understood correctly, modeled on the Bordeaux precedent of 1807, and that the English equivalent would require adjustment for the differences in maritime insurance law. Every head in the room turned. Marin stood in the doorway holding a tray of fresh candles that Mrs. Ordish had sent her to deliver. She was wearing her gray chambermaid's dress with the white cap and the apron that had a small ink stain on the left pocket from her notebook. She was looking directly at the Comte de Séranville with an expression that contained no apology, no embarrassment, and no deference, only the calm, level attention of a woman who had understood every word spoken in that room and had chosen, for the first time in 6 months, to prove it. The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it takes for a man to understand that he has been fundamentally wrong about something he never thought to question. The Comte recovered first, because diplomats always do. He inclined his head. He asked in French whether Mademoiselle would be so kind as to assist with the remaining points of discussion. Marin set down the candles. She stepped forward. She translated the Comte's terms with a precision that made the Reverend Mr. Hale set down his fork and listen. She clarified 2 points of ambiguity that the Comte himself had not realized were ambiguous. She rendered the Duke's responses, halting, distracted, delivered by a man who was staring at his chambermaid as though she had removed a mask he had not known she was wearing, into French so polished that the Comte later wrote to his wife that the Duke of Inverell's household contained the finest linguist he had encountered outside of the Quai d'Orsay. When the discussion concluded, Marin inclined her head, retrieved her tray of candles, and left the dining room. She did not look at the Duke as she passed. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, the study she had cleaned 100 times, the study where he had read aloud every letter, every private frustration, every unguarded thought, and he understood, slowly and then all at once, the dimensions of what had happened. She could speak. She had always been able to speak. She had chosen not to, and in choosing not to, she had heard everything he had ever said in her presence, and he had said a great deal, because he had believed she could not understand, and believing she could not understand had made him careless, and his carelessness had made him exposed, and his exposure was complete. He tried to reconstruct the inventory of his own indiscretions and found it bottomless. She had been present when he told Pollard that Lord Delaney's offer for the North Pasture was an insult dressed in politeness. She had been kneeling by the grate when he dictated a letter to his solicitor accusing the man, in terms that were precise and unflattering, of billing for competence he did not possess. She had been replacing candles in the wall sconces when he read his mother's letter aloud, and said, to no one, he had thought, to the empty room, that he would sooner marry the parlor cat than submit to another of her introductions. She had heard him confess his loneliness to the dark shelves of the library as though the books might absorb it, and she had said nothing, done nothing, taken nothing. She had folded his private life into the same silence she folded his linens, neatly, completely, without leaving a crease. He rang for Mrs. Ordish at 7 the following morning. Mrs. Ordish arrived with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this summons for some time. "The chambermaid," the Duke said. "Marin." "Yes, Your Grace." "She is not a chambermaid." Mrs. Ordish folded her hands. "No, Your Grace, I do not believe she is." "You knew." "I suspected. Her handwriting is educated. Her hands are not a servant's hands. She carries herself like a woman who was taught to enter a room, not clean one. And you said nothing." "She needed employment, Your Grace. She was excellent at her work. I did not consider it my place to investigate what she was before she came here, only to assess what she was while she remained." The Duke dismissed Mrs. Ordish and sent Pollard to make inquiries. Pollard, who was thorough in the way that stewards must be, returned by evening with a name: Delvaux. Sir Philip Delvaux, formerly of His Majesty's diplomatic service, posted to Paris, Vienna, and Copenhagen across a career of 22 years. Recalled in disgrace 4 years ago, accused of passing confidential correspondence to a French intermediary during the negotiations following the Treaty of Amiens. Never formally charged, never formally cleared. His reputation was destroyed, his pension revoked, his family left with nothing but a house in Warwickshire that was sold to cover debts, and 3 daughters who had been educated at embassy schools across Europe, and now found themselves unable to secure employment because no respectable household would engage the daughter of a man whose name was synonymous with betrayal, and no diplomatic family would receive her, and no agency would place her. And so she had done the only thing left to a woman of education and no prospects. She had made herself less than she was, and she had survived. The Duke sat with this information for a long time. He sat with the knowledge that the woman who had dusted his mantelpiece and swept his hearth and polished his brass fittings was the daughter of a diplomat, educated in 3 languages at least, raised in embassy drawing rooms, trained in precisely the kind of conversation and negotiation that he himself had avoided his entire adult life. He sat with the knowledge that she had heard him call his solicitor incompetent, heard him dismiss Lord Beckford as craven, heard him confess to his empty library that the silence in his house sounded like something waiting. He sat with the knowledge that she had kept every word and used none of it, and asked for nothing. He sent for her the following morning. She came to the study, the same desk, the same brass fittings she had polished on her knees, and stood before him with her hands folded and her chin level and her gray dress pressed and her cap straight, and nothing in her expression that conceded anything at all. "Miss Delvaux," he said. She did not flinch at the name. She met his gaze and waited. "You can speak." "Yes, Your Grace." Her voice was exactly as it had been in the dining room, clear, low, unhurried, as though she had been speaking all along and he had simply not been listening. "You chose not to." "I chose to be employed. The two were, for a time, incompatible. You heard everything I said in this room." "I heard what was said in my presence, yes." "And you told no one." "There was no one to tell, Your Grace, and nothing I heard that was worth the telling. A man frustrated with his solicitor and tired of his mother's letters is not a scandal. It is a Tuesday." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, not quite a wince. He looked at her the way a man looks at a landscape he has crossed 100 times and suddenly sees from a height. "Your father," he said carefully. "The accusations were never proven," she said, "nor disproven. My father was a careful man who made enemies among people who were less careful. Whether that constitutes guilt, I've spent 4 years declining to decide." "And your sisters?" "One married, modestly, to a curate in Shropshire who does not read the London papers. One lives with an aunt in Edinburgh who pretends our surname is Delford and does not receive visitors. I am here." "You are here," the Duke repeated, "cleaning my study." "I was cleaning your study. I suspect that arrangement has concluded." "It has." She nodded once. There was no tremor in it, no appeal. She had prepared for this, had been preparing since the moment she opened her mouth in the dining room, knowing that speech would end the life she had built in silence. She turned toward the door. "Miss Delvaux." She stopped. "I'm not dismissing you." She turned back. For the first time since he had known her, since he had failed to know her, something unguarded moved across her face. Not hope, not relief, something closer to confusion, as though she had rehearsed every possible outcome of this conversation, and this was not among them. "I'm asking you to sit down." She sat, not in the servant's chair by the door, but in the chair opposite his desk, the chair where his solicitor sat, where Pollard sat, where men of business and rank sat when they came to discuss matters of consequence. She sat in it the way she had spoken French, as though she had always belonged there and had merely been waiting to be recognized. They talked for 2 hours. She told him about Vienna, the embassy winters, the music, the particular quality of light on the Danube in December. She told him about Copenhagen, where her father had been happiest, and where she had learned Danish from a fisherman's daughter who lived near the harbor. She told him about the morning the letter came, recalling her father, and how her mother had read it aloud at breakfast, and then set it beside her plate and finished her tea, and how Marin had understood, watching her mother's hands not shaking, that composure was not the absence of feeling, but the decision to carry it quietly. She told him about the agency in London that had turned her away 3 times, about the letter of reference she had written herself, borrowing the name of a woman her mother had once employed in Warwickshire, gambling that no one would check. About the decision to present as mute, not because she could not speak, but because speech would betray her. Her accent was educated. Her vocabulary was precise. Her French was better than her English in certain registers. A speaking chambermaid with Marin Delvaux's voice would last a week before someone asked questions she could not afford to answer. The Duke listened. He listened the way she had listened for 6 months, completely, without interruption, with the growing awareness that the person before him contained more than he had allowed himself to imagine. When she finished, he said, "I owe you an apology." "For what, Your Grace?" "For not seeing you. You were not meant to see me, that was the point." Nevertheless, she studied him with the expression he was beginning to recognize, the diplomat's daughter assessing the room, weighing what to say against what was wise. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I came here under false pretenses. I deceived your household. I heard private conversations I had no right to hear. If anyone owes a debt, it is mine." "Then we are even," the Duke said, "and we shall start from here." The household adjusted, as households do, with a mixture of gossip and pragmatism. Mrs. Ordish, who had suspected from the beginning, received the news with a single raised eyebrow that contained within it a full autobiography of vindication. Jessup, who had shown the girl to her room 6 months ago and thought nothing of it, reconsidered every interaction with the quiet attentiveness of a man rewriting his own memories. Pollard, who dealt in facts, simply amended the household ledger. The Duke offered Marin a position, not as a chambermaid but as his secretary of correspondence, handling the French and continental letters that had previously been managed badly by his solicitor's clerk in London. She accepted. She moved from the servants' corridor to a room on the 2nd floor, modest, but with a writing desk by the window and a view of the garden she had tended in her few free hours, though no one had known it was her who had staked the roses when the wind came in March. She wrote his letters. She translated his documents. She sat in his study, in the chair opposite the desk, always, and they worked in a silence that was no longer the silence of invisibility, but the silence of 2 people who had discovered that they thought at the same pace and did not need to fill the space between thoughts with noise. It was during this period that the Duke began to notice things he had no professional reason to notice, that she tucked a strand of hair behind her left ear when she was concentrating, that she pressed her lips together, not frowning, not smiling, something between the two, when she encountered a passage of particularly poor French in the solicitor's correspondence, that she drank her tea without sugar and held the cup in both hands even when it was no longer warm, as though the habit of holding on to warmth was older than the house she sat in. He noticed that she laughed rarely but well, a single startled sound, as though she had forgotten she was permitted to, and that the occasions on which he provoked it were becoming, quietly, the best part of his day. She noticed things about him too, though she was more practiced at noticing without being seen to notice. She noticed that he rubbed the bridge of his nose when a letter irritated him, and that he stood at the window when he was thinking, and that he spoke more softly in the evenings, as though the day had worn the edges off his voice. She noticed that he asked her opinion, first on the French correspondence, then on the English, then on matters that had nothing to do with correspondence at all, and that he listened to her answers with the same complete attention she had once given his unguarded confessions. The difference was that now the attention was mutual. Spring turned. The garden she had staked bloomed. The Comte de Séranville wrote from Bristol to say that the wool agreement had been finalized on terms favorable to both parties, and to inquire whether Mademoiselle Delvaux might be prevailed upon to review the translation of the final contract. The Duke forwarded the letter to Maureen without comment. She reviewed the contract, corrected 2 errors, and returned it to the Comte with a note so diplomatically precise that the Comte wrote again, this time to the Duke, suggesting that if His Grace did not intend to marry the woman, the Comte knew several gentlemen in Paris who would. The Duke read this letter aloud in his study. Maureen was present, replacing a candle in the wall sconce. She did not react. He read it again, silently, after she had gone. It was June when he found her in the library at an hour when she should not have been there. She was reading, not a novel, but a bound volume of parliamentary proceedings from the previous session, her finger tracing the margin notes his father had left decades ago. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. And in that silence was everything that had accumulated between them over 9 months. The months of invisibility, the months of recognition, the slow and careful architecture of a respect that had become something more, and that neither of them had named because naming it would require them to decide what to do about it. "You are reading my father's notes," the Duke said. "He had excellent instincts on the Corn Laws," Maureen replied. "Better than Lord Beckford." "Most people have better instincts than Lord Beckford." "Yes, but your father could articulate why." Then the Duke sat down, not at his desk but in the chair beside hers, the reading chair by the window where the late light came in and turned the dust motes gold. He sat close enough that his sleeve brushed her arm, and she did not move away. "The Comte de Séranville," he said, "believes I should marry you." "The Comte de Séranville," Maureen said, "is a diplomat. He sees alliances everywhere." "Is he wrong?" She set down the book. She turned to face him, and her expression held the same steady, ungovernable clarity it had held in the dining room when she had opened her mouth and changed everything. "You are a duke," she said. "I am the daughter of a disgraced diplomat who spent 6 months cleaning your house under a false name. The Tun will say you have been deceived. Your mother will say you have been bewitched. Lord Beckford will say something craven and self-serving. Lord Beckford always does. This is not a small thing, Your Grace. Lawrence." She paused. In 9 months she had never used his Christian name. She'd gone from silence to speech to something approaching equality, but the name, his name, without the title, was a threshold she had not crossed. "Lawrence," she said quietly, as though testing whether the word could hold everything she meant by it. He took her hand. Not the way a duke takes a servant's hand, commanding, proprietary, but the way a man takes the hand of a woman he has come to know through her silences and her competence and her refusal to be less than she is, even when being less was the only way to survive. "I have spent 9 years in this house," he said, speaking to rooms I believed were empty. "You are the first person who listened. I do not intend to let that go." They were married in September, in the chapel at Inverell Park, with Mrs. Ordish in the front pew wearing an expression that suggested she had foreseen this outcome approximately 6 months before anyone else. The Comte de Séranville sent a case of Bordeaux and a letter in French that Maureen translated for the guests, omitting, with the diplomatic discretion she had inherited from her father, the passage in which the Comte took full credit for the match. Jessup served the wine at the wedding breakfast with the same reflexive grace he brought to everything, and if his hand trembled slightly when he poured for the new Duchess, the girl he had shown to the servants' corridor 10 months ago, no one remarked upon it. Her sisters came. The one from Shropshire, with her curate husband, who turned out to be a mild and bookish man who got on well with the Reverend Mr. Hale. The one from Edinburgh, who had been calling herself Delford for 4 years, sat in the chapel and heard the name Delvaux spoken aloud, by the clergyman, by the duke, by the guests, and wept, not from sorrow, but from the particular relief of a woman who no longer had to pretend her own name was something to be hidden. Marin's father was not present. Sir Philip Delvaux had died 18 months earlier, in a rented room in Calais, still waiting for the exoneration that never came. Marin did not speak of him during the ceremony, but that evening, after the guests had gone, she sat at the writing desk in the room that was now hers, not the modest secretary's room, but the Duchess's chambers, with the view of the garden she had staked in secret, and she wrote a letter to no one. She wrote it in French, because French had been her father's language, the language of his career and his disgrace and his silence. She wrote that she had married a man who had heard her speak and had not looked away. She folded the letter and placed it in the desk drawer and did not send it, because there was no one left to send it to, and because some letters are written not to be read but to be finished. The Duke, Lawrence, found it a year later, when their daughter was 3 months old and Marin had gone to London to meet with the Comte de Serenville's trading partners, because the wool business had expanded, and the Duke had discovered that his wife's French was more valuable to the estate than his steward's arithmetic. He was not looking for the letter. He was looking for a pen. He read it because it was there, and because he had learned, over the course of a year, that the things Marin wrote when she believed no one was watching were the truest things she had. He placed it back in the drawer. He did not mention it. Some silences, he had come to understand, were not emptiness. They were the space a person kept for the things that mattered too much to say aloud. They named the child Celestine, after Marin's mother. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and before she could walk, she had already learned to sit in the study while her parents worked, her mother translating, her father reading aloud, the room full of words and silence in equal measure, the way the best rooms always are. The east wing was repaired. The drainage scheme was completed, using a design that Marin had found in a Danish agricultural journal and translated for Pollard, who had stared at it for 10 minutes and then said, with the grudging admiration of a man whose profession had just been improved by someone else's wife, that it was better than anything his surveyors had proposed. The solicitor was replaced. Marin had identified his specific incompetence within a week of reviewing his correspondence, and the Duke had marveled, not for the first time, that the most qualified person in his household had spent 6 months emptying his ash grate. The Reverend Mr. Hale continued to attend dinners, but no longer attempted French, instead applying himself to the claret with a dedication that the Comte de Serenville, in his letters, described as très anglais. On the anniversary of the dinner, the 14th of April, a year to the day since a chambermaid had stepped forward and spoken and changed everything that followed, the Duke placed a single object on Marin's writing desk. It was the reference letter, the one she had written herself, in a borrowed name, in a hand that Mrs. Ordish had recognized as too educated for a servant. He had kept it. He had kept it since Mrs. Ordish had shown it to him the morning after the dinner, and he had read it, and he had seen what she had done to survive, and he had understood that the woman who had written that letter, calmly, precisely, without self-pity, was the woman he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. Marin looked at the letter. She looked at the Duke. She said nothing, not because she could not speak, but because some moments do not require speech, and she had always known the difference. They arrive here, like a voice that was always there, and needed only silence to be heard whenever they are ready.